Ambler, and I will be the moderator today. We're delighted that you have joined us for our Innovate to Dominate webinar. Let me introduce our presenter, Robert Bradford. Robert is the CEO of the Center for Simplified Strategic Planning and has conducted over 1,600 strategic planning meetings in the past 27 years. Today, he will be sharing some tools for thinking about innovation that have yielded fantastic results in companies in a wide range of industries. If you wish to ask questions, you may do so either in the GoToWebinar chat box or the GoToWebinar question box, or wait until the end of the program when Robert will be answering questions. Robert?
Thanks, Tom. Just before I start, a little bit about who I am and why you might want to listen to me. I've worked with a number of people. I have 3 clients now that have gotten on the Forbes 400 list. My clients have generated over $50 billion in increased profits in the last 5 years. I've done, it says here, over 1,000 plans, but actually over 1,600 strategic planning meetings, blah, blah, blah. What you're not going to get today are poems, fluff, or nonsense. What I really want to share with you today are ideas that I generated after reflecting upon innovations that have succeeded with dozens of companies in the strategic planning process over the past 27 years. So I would like to talk about 3 specific strategic innovation tools that you can use, and I'm going to get in depth on each of those, but there's a lot of material to cover, so I'm probably going to go pretty quickly. The first one I want to talk about is turning threats into opportunities. The second one is finding unmet needs, and the third is leveraging strategic competency. Each one of these has, in more than just 1 or 2 occasions, yielded tremendous results from not just innovation, but innovations that have truly distinguished a company or a business and have resonated very well with the clients or customers of that business. So I'm going to talk about the first tool, turning threats into opportunities. This sounds a little bit cliche. I think a lot of people talk about how you want to do this, but the reality is threats can be turned into opportunities in all kinds of ways. When you feel threatened strategically, it's almost always because there's something happening which is imbalancing the environment that you're in, usually imbalancing the markets that you're in. It could be technology, it could be acquisitions, it could be shifts in demographics. Any sort of thing can cause you to feel threatened. But it's important to remember that when you feel threatened, opportunity always exists there because there's likely to be a big shift in the competitive makeup of the industry or dynamic you're involved in. I'll give you a few examples that I've worked through, some of them with companies and some that are just pretty well known. The first example I like to use is a client of mine in the Midwest that for years was in the business of making tax return forms. When we did strategic planning, they were very concerned about the rising threat of paperless taxes, and many of you maybe today even are using either software or going online to a website to prepare your taxes instead of using forms. So one of the things we did when we were looking at this is we first asked, is this a real thing? Is it something customers are going to prefer? And we said, yes, definitely. And so it really was threatening our core product. And so we looked closely at the company's strategic competencies, found that they were really good at handling compliance with the laws, and we used that to build the basis of a software product. And now if you go to a website or you use tax form programs, the forms are very likely the product of my client who's done a lot of research on how to print these forms and make them legally compliant across a wide range of platforms. So that's a really good example of taking something that was threatening the company and turn it into an opportunity that made the company even bigger than they were when they were just selling paper. The second threat is one we're all familiar with. In the 1980s and 90s, people who were paying attention to technology were very much aware that there was this rising convergence of technological devices, and in particular the phone and the computer were starting to converge more and more. The opportunity for that, of course, was Apple turned that into a big opportunity with the iPhone. They basically said, let's let's take the technologies we have in portable electronics and turn that into a highly user-friendly, usable device that yields this convergence. Another example I like to use is a client of mine that was in the insurance business, and they had a very strong showing in the market for insurance with people with lower incomes. And as we started to look closely at that, we realized that we were able to and were getting a lot of insurance customers who wanted us to insure their mobile homes. But when you think about mobile homes and hurricanes, it doesn't sound very good. In fact, a lot of competitors were staying away from this market. But what we found is because we had a strong relationship with people in that market, and also because people were asking us to do this over and over again, we actually developed better data and better systems for handling hurricanes. And we also noticed that the risk wasn't nearly as high as people think. Hurricanes usually don't hit across the whole country at once. They're usually, the intense damage is highly localized. So by the time they sold this company for a very handsome sum of money, this company had 80% share in the market for insuring mobile homes against hurricanes. And they turned something that most of their competitors viewed as a negative and turned it into a positive. Another much broader threat that I see a lot of companies wrestling with these days is losing big customers. One I just went through with a client of mine over the past year and a half or 2 years was a client that was very worried about losing a big customer in the cell phone business. And it turned out that customer is seeing their sales go down dramatically. But because we looked at this strategically and said, well, what is the real opportunity here? We started to push into figuring out how we could make more money selling to smaller customers instead of large customers. This enabled us to back away from feeling like we were being held prisoner by any particular large customer. It also yielded much higher margins. Now, there was a downside to this, which was that we focused on larger customers because it was easier to get big numbers from selling them. They're easier to handle. A lot of small customers can be harder to handle, but the upside is the margins were much higher, so it was a real opportunity for them. So when you're faced with threats, I have 4 questions I like to ask to get better ideas about how I can turn the threat into the opportunity. The first is, why does this thing threaten us? What exactly about this do I find threatening? And in this question, we want to not just come up with the obvious, like it's going to reduce our sales, for example, but I want to ask, is there some reason why we can't function as well with this threat as other people can? Because maybe we need to take steps to deal with that. The second question, how do our customers feel about it, is really important. If your customers like the thing that's threatening you, you're probably not going to succeed in defending yourself from it. That threat's going to happen, and it's going to happen big time. The more customers like a threat, the more it's going to happen. And so instead of trying to fight it or push back on it, you need to lean into that threat as much as you can. And if the threat is something your customers don't like, you can create allies of those customers by asking them to sort of help you fight the threat. A good example of this that I've seen recently is with a lot of small independent bookstores are fighting the idea that you only buy books online or you're doing e-books, and they've started to push the envelope on what you can do with a small independent bookstore, and they've very successfully, in many communities, there's one here in Vermont that I just saw a few months ago, they've really enlisted the help of their customers to build the independent bookstore not just as a place you buy books, because you can do that on Amazon, but also as a social hub and as a place where you go even though the books may cost you a little bit more money. The third question, what do we need to learn, is an important one. In many cases, we'll feel threatened by external things happening to us because there's something we don't know. There's something we need to learn about how to be successful in the new environment. And it's very important to be clear that there are things you need to learn, and that if you don't learn them, the threat will be worse than if you do. And then finally, the question I love to ask is, what if we could become the threat? What if instead of fighting having our product or service knocked out of the market by some change in the environment, we can actually cause that to occur? Then we gain a lot more control of the threat, and it becomes a much bigger opportunity. All of these lead to some very useful innovations in most companies. It causes you to rethink your business, how you do business, and why you're resisting change. And it causes you to ask the question, how can I embrace this change in a way that will put me on top of this threat? So the second tool I want to talk to you about is identifying unmet needs. Again, a very basic concept. Success in business revolves around finding needs in the marketplace and meeting them better than other people. But again, while it's a simple concept, most people have trouble with this. The first thing I like to tell people is you want to understand exactly who your real target market is. In doing so, you need to understand these 3 points. First of all, customers rarely choose suppliers at random. There are reasons why they buy from you or from someone else. And if there is no reason, if there's no differentiation, they are probably choosing on the basis of convenience, who called me last, or on the basis of price, which is my least favorite reason. The second thing you want to be aware of is that that preference for price tends to cause monolithic markets to commoditize. When you look at especially large markets of very simple products, it's very easy for something like ballpoint pens to become commoditized, and most of the products in that market can become very inexpensive very quickly. Being aware of that, you have to understand if you are pursuing a specialty strategy, and I hope you are because it's a better path to profitability, you need to look for the ways to fragment that market and pick a piece of that so that you aren't just riding the downhill wave of commoditization. And the third point is very important. Profit lies in doing exactly that, identifying underserved specialty markets, because as a market commoditizes, and just think about how you feel about air travel, for example, the airlines try to make more and more money by just making your experience as a passenger suck a little bit more every year. And if you can find passengers who are unhappy with that and willing to pay a little extra money to have a slightly better experience, that can be a niche that you can gain a lock on and some really solid preference. And if you look back, we talked about Apple and the iPhone. I think that's one of the things Apple did in their computer business for years is they basically targeted people who are dissatisfied with buying mainstream Windows, DOS-based computers. And that underserved market isn't huge. It's not 90% of the market for computers, but that 10 or 20% of the market, or maybe 30% today, is quite profitable for Apple because they have a real lock on those customers. This drives off of something I refer to as a value system, which success in business usually is created when you have some advantage and you figure out a way to convert that advantage into value for your customers. However, the perception of value from your customers is also going to come right hand in hand with a perception that you're doing something that works on behalf of your competition. So your competitors are going to see that what you're doing works, and they're probably going to copy it as a result. And that's bad news because it means you have to constantly push forward to stay ahead of competition. But it's good news because you've now defined the strategic situation so your competitors are playing catch up with you and they're copying you. It means you can never rest on your laurels, but it also means that if you constantly push forward and test what you are capable of doing, you will be able to stay ahead of the competition. I just like to put in this dramatic photograph to give people a little bit of a break. And now I'd like to ask the question, if meeting needs is such a great way to be successful, why is it that customers' needs go unmet in the marketplace? And there are 4 really common reasons, and I'd like to talk about each one. The first is just inertia. And inertia can come from a lot of different places. There's process inertia. And a really simple way of thinking about process inertia is most businesses have a machine that they've set up for doing things. This is how we sell to customers. This is how we create our product or service. This is how it's delivered. And those processes may not fit well with a changed environment that's threatening you. And because of that inertia, you may not change as quickly as your customers would like you to, and you can end up holding the short end of a stick if you keep doing business the way you used to. The second source of inertia is distribution systems, and this is very common. A good way to think about this is think about grocery stores. Grocery stores are basically set up to sell all kinds of different things that people want, mostly food items. But that distribution system requires certain things happen. Maybe there's a centralized hub for distribution, and then semi-trucks go to that hub and pick up product and then deliver it to the individual supermarket that you go to in your neighborhood, for example. That distribution system has strengths and weaknesses which will cause inertia in the marketplace. And there are some great ways to get away from that kind of inertia. One of the things that's really been interesting in the past few years is that this inertia has become almost a death sentence for a lot of old companies because they want to rely on physical distribution systems that are built around people buying things locally in stores. And there is a lot of business. There's a lot of sales available right now online, direct, and not just direct to you, but also in many cases people are selling directly to a store instead of through a distributor. And so there's a lot of turmoil around those markets, and that turmoil means both threats and opportunities for the people involved. A third source of inertia that I have a real bone to pick with is experts. And I see this a lot because in a lot of industries where I work, most of the companies work with some kind of industry expert on their strategic planning, which I think is a terrible mistake. Industry experts are only going to give you the answer that they think is going to work, and they're going to give the same answer to everybody in your industry. One of the things I can absolutely predict just by looking at where your strategy is coming from and how you're thinking about it is that if your strategy, if your answers, if your innovations are the same as other people in your industry, you can bet you're going to make less money than someone who comes up with something completely different. Being similar is the kiss of death in business strategy, and industry experts tend to bring that in wholesale because they bring the same thinking to everyone, and they often are talking to people about how everybody else does things. And you don't want to do things the way other people do things, especially if you're trying to be innovative. The second main category I want to talk about here is fear of business models. And the basic idea here is just that when we look at different business models, we feel very uncomfortable with it in most businesses because we know how we make money with the given business model that we're already working with. Whether, for example, if you're selling through distribution, the idea of selling directly is very frightening to you. And as a result, usually the people who make the jump to different business models or new business models are often the people who are at the bottom of the heap with the old business model. And that's one of the causes of the big changes we've seen in a lot of businesses, a lot of industries today. We see people who were the top player 20 years ago are seriously threatened and challenged today. The third major category I want to talk about is lack of perception. That is, sometimes we just don't perceive customer needs because our market research doesn't lead us to it. I think one of the most common examples of this is when your market research includes a lot of subsets of sometimes underserved customers who have very different ideas about the way things should be, but the data about them is lost because they're averaged in with a mass of customers that you talk to. The classic case that I see happen over and over again is in the division between specialty customers and commodity customers. In most markets, 60 to 80% of the customers are going to be commodity customers. That is, if you're focusing on the specialty customer, your market share is unlikely to rise above about 30 to 40%. But if you do market research on, let's say, automobiles, the average customer in the United States probably wants a Ford Taurus or a Toyota Camry. And if that's what you deliver to them, you're going to have tremendously underserved customers at the extremes of the spectrum, either the very low cost who want a much cheaper car than a Taurus or a Camry, or at the very high end, people who want a much more expensive car than a Camry or a Taurus. And we don't perceive those needs unless we slice and dice our data slightly different ways and really try to home in on the customers who are really truly dissatisfied with what's available right now in the marketplace. The last reason why needs go unmet is one I see quite often, and it comes from commodity thinking, and it is a reluctance to add cost or time. And when I talk about this, I get really incensed because I often see people come up with great ideas that would work really well, but they're unwilling to do it because it will require that they hire more expensive people, or they spend more time on their customers, or spend more money on something they're doing for their customers. And that's just backwards thinking. The reason I think it's backwards is if you can spend more time or money on something in a way that really creates value for your customers, you're actually distinguishing yourself in a way that will make those customers much more loyal to you in the future, because you're offering something that other people aren't willing to do. If you're reluctant to do that, you're dooming your business to be a me too player, and you're almost automatically going to end up on the commodity trail, which leads to lower profitability, lower margins, and real serious threats to your business if you're not the #1 volume player in your market. So those are the main reasons why needs go unmet. How do we overcome this inertia? The first thing I want you to do, and I already alluded to this, is you want to look for allies inside your business, people who are excited about changing things inside your organization, but also outside your organization. Look for the dissatisfied customer. Look for that underserved customer. And if you deal with distribution, look for the pieces of the distribution channel that are in the back seat because they're not the #1 player. Those people are very likely to be your allies. Also look at suppliers. If you have suppliers who are not the #1 player, they may see you as a way to gain their market position very quickly by basically hitching up their cart to your pony. And those allies can drive you to overcome inertia a lot more easily. The second thing is definitely don't rely upon experts. Experts can do certain things for you, but remember, in particular, industry experts are almost always going to give you the same answer they give everyone else, and that's not going to lead to innovation. Also, the third point here, you may want to just change your organization. Even if there's no other reason to change your organization, if changing your organization will cause people to approach the problems in your business differently, you can gain innovative muscle from that. Finally, in strategic planning, I always like to ask people the question, what would happen if our competitors did this? Is there anything that would particularly scare you about one of your competitors doing this? And if you're worried about your competitors doing something, by golly, you should be asking yourself, can we do this? Because if you do it, if you're the one causing this problem, then you're going to force your competitors to react to you rather than the other way around. So what I'd like to do now is talk to you about how you can find unmet needs. One of my favorite exercises, and this is a good, if you have the ability to do focus groups or talk to customers, you can ask them this. Ask customers, if you had a magic wand and could change anything about what you do, what happens when you purchase our service or our product, what kinds of things would you change? And just listen very closely to the answers. Sometimes they're going to give answers that are really hard to deal with, but if you can figure out a way to fulfill their sort of magic wand fantasy, you can gain a real leg up in meeting their needs better than your competitors. You may also want to compare to other industries. Now, this is a place where experts can help a little bit, and I'm not talking about experts in your industry. I'm actually saying somebody who has a much more cross-industry, a much broader perspective, may be able to bring in ideas from an entirely different business. Last year, for example, I was working with someone in construction, and we came up with an idea from somebody else I had worked with in the insurance industry that's worked really well for them and helped them really amp up their sales and get people selling for them that aren't the normal kind of salespeople. It's been very efficient and useful for them. So if you can look at ways that other industries have changed and other industries have improved how they serve customers and bring that type of change into your own industry, that type of innovation can be incredibly powerful because in many cases you already know that innovation works, which is great. It's like a sure bet. The third way to find unmet needs is examine the surrounding behaviors. And what I mean by that is I don't just want to look at the customer's behavior. I want to look at all behaviors surrounding the production of your product or service, the delivery of your product or service, and yes, the purchasing behaviors and the consumption of your product or service. Because there may be some behaviors around that that indicate that there is a need that's not being met very well. One example I can think of from insurance that I thought was very interesting is if you look at people who install carpeting in the United States, it's almost never, and when I say almost never, there are a few exceptions, but it's almost never done by the people who sell carpeting. And that doesn't make any sense from one perspective. That is, I'd like to be able to go to a store, buy some carpeting, and arrange, have them arrange to have it installed. But they don't do it that way. Now, the reason they don't do it that way is that carpet installation is a more physical task, and the workers' comp insurance is very expensive compared to selling carpet in a retail store, and that's why they tend to split up. But when we looked at that behavior, one of the things that we decided to do was try and figure out a way to make that interface more seamless, so even though a store doesn't sell the carpeting, that we have a bunch of well-trained installers who aren't necessarily employees of our company, but understand how we do things and fit the brand image of our business, and that works very well. So let's talk about the third and final tool for innovation, which is leveraging strategic competency, and this is a real favorite of mine. In my mind, strategic competency is the source of all of the biggest home runs that I've seen companies hit. And when I talk about people hitting home runs, I'm talking about people I've worked with who've gone from having 19 or 20 employees to selling the company for $1 billion a few years later. Those home runs have always come from an awareness of strategic competency and a disciplined focus around that. So some of you may not be familiar with the term, or you may have heard the term misused, so I'm going to give you the definition so you're clear on it. A competency is know-how. It's a combination of skills, processes, and knowledge. It's what you and your people bring into work inside your brains every day. And a strategic competency creates significant value for your customers and differentiates you from your competition. Now, the third item there, difficult to copy. Obviously, if it's not difficult to copy, it won't differentiate you for very long. But those two elements are really important. A strategic competency has to be something that makes a difference for the customer, and it has to be something you can do, but a lot of competitors, or ideally no other competitors, can do. So when I talk about strategic competency, what I like to think about, just in my own abstract brain, is I'm seeking out something I call the island of profitability. And the island of profitability is this one physical place where if you look at the little simple chart I have here, the vertical axis of this is how much money you're making. And there is one spot that if you stay in that spot, you know how to do what you do better than anybody else. And you can make more money doing that than anyone else. Anybody else who tries to get there doesn't bring the same know-how to the table. Professional athletes obviously do this very, very well in their sport. Doesn't mean they can't be good at other sports, but when you look at a true star, they're so good at the one thing that they really excel at that nobody else can touch them. And the same thing's true in business. If we find that spot and make sure that all of our innovation and play is around that spot and using that spot, that can lead to some really great outcomes. So one of the things I like people to think about is using competencies. You can rate them. Anything you think is a competency, you can put it on this very simple chart and rate it. On the vertical axis, we have the value. How valuable is it? High, medium, or low value. Very simple rating. And on the horizontal axis, we rate how unique are you. Now, if you're low in uniqueness, that means that any one of your competitors can probably do that. So what, right? And if you're high in uniqueness, it might mean that nobody else in the world can do what you can do, or has the know-how that you have. And those items are often very, very useful. In using this chart, I like to point out to people there are 3 separate zones that we want to be concerned with. The low uniqueness and low value area, that sort of L-shaped area, and I always tell people, think of that as the bad part because L is for loser. That's the so what zone. And in that area, you may do something that's very valuable, but everybody else does too. So, for example, I speak at conventions, and one of the things I sometimes hear people say is, well, who do that, they say, well, I always show up on time. And you know what? So what? Everybody who speaks for a living shows up on time. That doesn't differentiate you from anyone. On the other hand, you can also have something where there's very high uniqueness, and you might get a so what out of that too. And the so what is, so what if you show up on stage in a tutu, it's not valuable to your customers? Or so what if everybody in your sales department is a scuba diver? Your customers don't care unless you're in the scuba business. So we want to move up into the areas where there are at least moderate to high uniqueness and moderate to high value. Every profitable company I've done this exercise with, that's where their competencies generally end up, in that area that's labeled profit, the profit zone. But what we want to try to do for innovation is we want to try and push ourselves up into the upper right-hand box, which I call the big bucks box. And moving up into that box involves a lot of challenges, and I want you to think about some very key things that we need to do in order to do that. First of all, we can always increase the value of a unique competency. You've got something that's unique but maybe moderate in value. If we can raise the value of the uniqueness we're bringing to the table, that can lead to innovation that will set you apart in a very serious way in the minds of your customers. And if they can perceive the value of your uniqueness, that may cause you to make more money. The second thing we want to do is increase the uniqueness of your valuable competencies. So, yeah, I always show up on time, but could I increase the uniqueness? Yes, I could. I could show up even earlier, for example. I could make sure that people know I'm there well ahead of time and help out with logistics. And in fact, because I'm always early and I always stay late at conferences, I always tell meeting planners who might hire me to speak at a conference, if you need a pinch hitter, if you need someone to fill in for somebody who doesn't show up because of weather, and I just had this happen last week when I was in New Orleans. There was terrible weather and terrible travel issues. I can be sort of an insurance policy, and that just takes a load off their mind, and it's quite a useful thing to do. The third thing I want you to think about is look at your real competencies and ask, if I'm really good at this, can I sell this in a completely different area? And in fact, for some of you, not just in a different area, you might be able to make good money selling that competency to your competitors. And that may sound a little strange, but think about it this way. If you look at some of the really successful technology companies, Samsung right now is a really good example. For years, Samsung made more money selling components that were made using their technology and their competency in mass-produce, not optics, but actually display systems. They used that competency to sell parts to Apple for the iPhone. And what you can do with that, I mean, that was a very profitable business for Samsung. If they stayed in bed with Apple, that probably would still be a profitable business. What they actually did is they turned that into a competitive product. So now, Samsung is the biggest competitor to Apple in the smartphone market, just as one example. So lots of different things you can do with understanding your competencies and using that as a basis for innovation. So to summarize, I've gone over 3 basic tools that I've seen a lot of different businesses use. First, turning your threats into opportunities. I want you to be aware anytime you feel threatened by something, you want to turn it around and say, is there a way I can turn this to my advantage? Secondly, finding unmet needs. And one of the most important things there is be aware that you may have inertia. You may think of yourself as being in a certain business, and you need to let go of that. And also, be aware that you may not be asking the right questions to the right people in your market research to really figure out where the unmet needs are. And then finally, leveraging your strategic competency. Understand what really does set you apart. And if you don't see a lot that sets you apart, then strategically your innovation needs to be about answering the question, what do I need to add to the table? What do I need to bring that will enable us to do really well with our customers and create more value for our customers than otherwise might exist? So with that being said, I want to talk to you briefly about some next steps you might want to take if you like what you learned here and want to learn more. We have a very generous offer on our website at cssp.com/rbradford, which is my name. And some of you may wish to also look at attending the Michigan State University Simplified Strategic Planning Seminar for really in-depth. It's a 2-day program. We get very in-depth, not just on the process and what it is and the concepts, but also how to do the process step by step and how to do it faster and better with better results than most people get. And you, of course, are invited to contact me with any questions. My phone number's up there, 734-665-2971, and you can email me at rbradford@cssp.com. Now, with that being said, I'd like to encourage you to do those things, but I'd like to see if there are any questions from anybody in the audience that anybody would like to address.
Robert, as you were speaking, a couple of questions came through. Are you ready for them?
Yeah, absolutely.
Here's one. As you were talking about unmet needs, I had the sense that your focus was primarily on the features of the product or service that was being offered. Couldn't the unmet needs just as likely involve customer-supplier relationship issues like ease of doing business or shared values?
Absolutely. A really good example of this, and sadly it did not work out, but I don't think it was because it was a bad innovation, was in the I think it was the early 1990s, General Motors started a division, the Saturn division, that decided they were going to market that you go into a Saturn showroom and there's just going to be one price. That's it. That's the only price that's out there. They never sold their cars at any of their prices. And they were really dealing with a customer relationship issue that a lot of people don't like in the car dealer business, which is, you know, you always feel like you're not necessarily getting the best deal because you don't really know what the price should be. So they just said, listen, this is the price and that's it. And it worked very well for them. It created a lot of positive reaction in the marketplace.
Here's another one. You suggest that threats can become opportunities for becoming more successful. Can great opportunities become threats, particularly when a competitor is better equipped to exploit it?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that a lot of people stumble into rather blindly sometimes is they get all excited about a big, huge opportunity. And one of the things I can tell you, and this is from experience with a lot of companies that have done things like this, is in many cases you can really tell the pioneers in an industry because they're the ones with the arrows in their backs. The world is just littered with companies that came up with a great innovation that was way too big for their company. I can remember a company I met a few years ago at a seminar that they had the original patent on the pocket calculator. And they had developed it as part of a contract with NASA for the space program in the late 1960s. And when this product came out, it was so exciting. Everybody wanted to buy one, even though it was very expensive at first. And they could not make this product to other larger companies that could make all the calculators, you know, the customers wanted. And unfortunately, the companies they outsourced to ended up taking that business away from them. And, you know, today it's I don't know, it's like a $30 or $40 million company, whereas the calculator market that they spawned is a, you know, $1 billion business.
Robert, that appears to be the end of the questions, unless someone else wants to submit one at this point. We thank you very much.
All right. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to hearing from you all.